Hello everyone. So I'm Dr. Jiji George from Department of Oral Pathology, Babu Banarsidass College of Dental Sciences, Lucknow. So I'm here today to speak about permanent maxillary first molar. So when we discuss about maxillary first permanent molar, we need to realize that it is the first tooth in the oral cavity. That is after the mandibular first molar, it is the next tooth in the oral cavity to erupt out as a permanent tooth. So let's start off with the teeth from different aspects. Now here we have pictures showing the teeth from the tooth from the labial aspect and from the proximal aspect and from the occlusal aspect. So you can see that both mesiodistally as well as faciolingually, the tooth has a shape of a trapezoid. But the trapezoid is has opposing sides near the cervical line. For example, either from the buccal or from the lingual aspect, you have this is the buccal aspect. So from the buccal aspect, we have all the three roots visible, which is why this is the buccal aspect. So the largest root is the palatal root, which is behind, so that you can't see it in the entirety. So we know that this is the buccal aspect. Now the buccal aspect, the crown of the buccal aspect looks like a trapezoid with the shorter side of the trapezoid near the cervical line and the longer end of the trapezoid at the occlusal line. But if you look onto the proximal aspects of the tooth, you can see that the longer side of the trapezoid is at the cervical line and the shorter side of the trapezoid is at the occlusal line. So that is the difference between the proximal aspect and the facial or the lingual aspects. Now coming on to the occlusal aspect, it's like a rhomboid. So you can see the rhomboid outline where you can see the mesial and the distal sides on each side, and then the other one is the facial and the lingual sides. Now this tooth has got two acute angles and two uh, obtuse angles. So the acute angles are the distolingual angle uh, and the mesiobuccal angle. And the obtuse angles are the distobuccal and the mesiolingual. So when you see from the occlusal aspect, we have the distolingual and the mesiobuccal, which are obtuse, and the other two are acute in nature. So coming on to the uh, number of cusps and the number of roots. So this permanent maxillary first molar has got two buccal cusps and two palatal cusps. So the two buccal cusps are basically seen here. This is the buccal aspect, and you can see the two buccal cusps out here. So this is a larger buccal cusp and this is a smaller buccal cusp, and in the center you can see there's a buccal developmental groove. And this is the lingual aspect where you can see the entire single palatal root or the lingual root, and you can see that there is um, a large cusp on this side, and then which is a shorter cusp on this side, a smaller cusp on this side. So you have two palatal cusps, and this small cusp that you can see is actually perched upon this larger cusp. So this cusp is called as the cusp of Caramelli. And in a nutshell, we can say that from the buccal aspect, you have two cusps and three roots which are visible, and both the buccal cusp and both the buccal roots. That is, one will be a mesiobuccal cusp, and the other one will be a distobuccal cusp. And the root as well will be a mesiobuccal root and a distobuccal root, because there's a furcation on the root. It's a two-rooted structure on the buccal aspect, but the lingual root also can be visible in the background. So if you talk about the lingual aspect or the palatal aspect, here we again have two cusps, but then two major cusps. But then there's a minor cusp called as the cusp of Caravelli out here. So the cusp of Caravelli is found on the mesiolingual cusp, and this cusp which is seen on the mesiolingual cusp is a smaller cusp. It's also called as a tubercle of Caravelli, and in between this distolingual and the mesiolingual cusp, you have a small developmental groove called as a lingual developmental groove. So you can see a palatal root out here, which is seen in the entirety, and in the background you can see both the buccal roots. So if this is the mesiolingual cusp where the tubercle of Caravelli is seen, That means this is the mesiolingual cusp. If this is the mesiolingual cusp, this is the mesiobuccal root, because that's a mesial aspect. So also to note that maxillary first molar forms from 5 lobes. So which are the other 2 teeth which has 5 lobes? One is the mandibular first molar and the mandibular second premolar with 3 cuspi. So that's about an introduction about the tooth that we are going to discuss today. So the buccal aspect of the permanent maxillary first molar will come into discussing into details of this buccal aspect. So again, as I explained to you, we can see that there's a crown and the root can be visible from the buccal aspect. So we'll first take the crown. So in the crown, you can see 2 cusps out here. So one is the mesiobuccal cusp and the other is the mesiolingual cusp. And you can see a small part of the lingual cusp, other than the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal, you can see a small part of the lingual cusp from the background. So having said that, I have already explained that it is like a trapezoid. So we would first explain that the shape of the crown is like a trapezoid, and the shorter part of the trapezium is at the cervical line, and the longer part of the trapezium is at the occlusal line. So, between the 2 cusps, that is from the between the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal cusps, we have the central one groove that is called as a buccal developmental groove. Now, this buccal developmental groove basically divides the mesiobuccal cusp from the distobuccal cusp. Now, this has got 4 outlines. The trapezium has got 4 outlines. As we already discussed, 2 outlines are formed. The first outline is formed by the cervical line. The second outline is formed by the occlusal line, and then you have 2 proximal outlines. So both these proximal outlines, one of them is the mesial outline and the other is the distal outline. So you can see that the mesial and the distal outlines are not straight. This is the mesial outline. This basically comes down as a straight line till the junction of the incisal and the middle third of the tooth, and then it kind of drops down into the to the cusp on the occlusal surface. But if you look at the distal outline is more or less convex. It's more convex than the mesial outline, and you can see that the crest of curvature or the maximum width is seen at the middle of the middle third, and then it drops down to the cusp tip. So you have both these cusps being divided by a buccal developmental group. So coming on to the next picture. So here again, we'll come to the mesial outline. This is the mesial outline. So the mesial outline is straight and the crest of curvature is 2/3 from the cervical line to the cusp tip. Now, if I divide this crown into 3 parts, I draw a line here and again I draw a line here. So now I have divided the buccal aspect of the crown into 3 parts. So now we have the occlusal aspect, occlusal third, we have the middle third, and we have the cervical third. So what they're trying to say is, on the mesial outline, on this outline, the crest of curvature means the maximum width of the tooth is seen at 2/3 from the cervical line to the cusp tip. That means from the cervical line to the cusp tip at 2/3. That is the junction of the occlusal third and the middle third. That is the 2/3, because the first third will be your cervical third, and the second third will be your middle third. So in this 2/3, after this 2/3 is your mesial crest of curvature. So what do you mean by crest of curvature? It is the point where this tooth is going to come in contact with the tooth on the mesial side. That is your second maxillary premolar. And this is the distal contact point. So the distal contact point is where the tooth is going to come in contact with the maxillary second molar. So the distal outline, as I already explained to you, is slightly convex, and the crest of curvature is at the middle of the middle third, half the distance from cervical line to the cusp, which means it is the middle of the middle third. And the distal aspect can also be seen slightly, because the tooth is going to taper a little from the distal towards the buccal aspect. That's why distal aspect can also be seen a little bit. Now, all the three roots can be seen. As I said, you can see if this is the mesiobuccal cusp, obviously this is the mesiobuccal root, and this is the distobuccal cusp, then this is the distobuccal root. Plus, in the background, you can see a little bit of uh, the lingual root. So all the three roots can be seen. And we can also see that the axis of the root is a little distally inclined. So by and large, the axis of the root would be a little towards the distal. So even looking at the axis of the root, you can identify whether that tooth is, the extracted tooth is a right or a left, first molar. So coming on to the lingual aspect, from the picture, you can see that the lingual aspect also, we can see a trapezoidal crown and the root. All the three roots are visible here as well. But the difference would be that you can see the single rooted large palatal root over here. There is no furcation that is visible from the lingual aspect. And we can see the outlines of both the buccal roots over here. So here we can see two cusps. This large cusp is the mesiolingual cusp, and the smaller one is the distolingual cusp, which mean to say that this is the distal outline and this is the mesial outline. So along the mesial outline, where you have the mesiolingual cusp, you have a cusp of Carabellae as well. So the cusp of Carabellae can be identified by looking at this thin line over here near the cusp. So this is the cusp of Carabellae, and this is the mesiolingual cusp, and this is the smaller one is the distolingual cusp. And in between the mesiolingual and the distolingual cusp, you have this small groove that is growing out from here, from the occlusal to the lingual side of the cusp. That is called as the lingual developmental groove. That's the lingual developmental groove. So all these points I've already explained to you. So let's move to the next slide. Now here again, we'll discuss about the proximal outlines. That is your, since this is a mesiolingual cusp, this will be your mesial outline. And since this is the distolingual cusp, this will be your distal outline. So the mesial outline is more or less straight, and the contact point is more towards the occlusal outline, and the distal outline is more or less convex. So the contact point is more at the middle of the middle third, like we saw in the buccal aspect. So and you can see that the cervical line is a straight line. It's irregularly straight line. It's not convex like you see in your incisors. And you can't see any root furcation out here. So coming on to the mesial aspect. So this is very important to know about the mesial aspect, because as I already discussed, that the mesial aspect is also, the crown also shows a trapezoidal shape, but then the larger side of the trapezium is at the cervical line, which is just the opposite of that what you saw in your lingual and the buccal aspects. And the shorter side of the trapezium is at the occlusal line. So since we know that there is a cusp of Carabellae on the mesiolingual cusp, here it is very easily visible that the cusp of Carabellae is out here. So which means this entire cusp must be mesiolingual. So since we are seeing the mesial aspect, this will be the lingual outline. If this is the mesiolingual cusp and this aspect is mesial, this outline has to be the lingual outline. So if this is the lingual outline, this will be the buccal outline. So a point to be noted is that we can see the lingual root over here, the palatal root, the single palatal root is here. And here you can see the mesiobuccal root. We cannot see the distobuccal root because this is not the distal aspect. So the mesiobuccal root is larger than the distobuccal root. So the distobuccal root is entirely masked away by the mesiobuccal root. Otherwise, the cervical line is more or less the same. It is more or less straight. And you can see the furcation out here, where the division between the palatal root and the mesiobuccal root. So this is the mesiolingual aspect of the your cusp, and this is the mesiobuccal cusp. So this is the mesiobuccal cusp, mesiobuccal root, mesiolingual cusp, and the lingual root, because there is only one root out here. So this is what you see is the marginal ridge. So you can see that this is the mesial marginal ridge, because the aspect is mesial. You will see the marginal ridge, which is the mesial marginal ridge. So this is about the mesial aspect. Now, I have already explained this to you. Now, the one point which I left out is level of bifurcation is closer to the cervical line. Now, this is the bifurcation, and this distance will be smaller than that of the distal aspect. Now, we'll come to the distal aspect in the next slide. So, this root trunk, this is called as a root trunk. The undivided portion of the root is called as the root trunk. So, they're trying to say that on the mesial aspect, the root trunk will be smaller and the root trunk will be larger on the distal aspect. Now, coming on to the distal aspect, it is just a mirror image of the mesial aspect. But here, since the distal aspect is a little smaller than the mesial aspect, you can see that on the distal aspect, the single palatal root is seen. But then on the if you look at the buccal roots, we can see the entire distobuccal root as well as a part of the outline of the mesiobuccal root as well, because mesiobuccal root is slightly larger than the distobuccal root, and the cervical line is more or less straight, and you can see the distal marginal ridge from here. So this is the distal marginal ridge. So, and we can see the two distal cusps, the distolingual cusp and the distobuccal cusp out here. So coming on to the occlusal aspect. Now, occlusal aspect is also very important in case of the maxillary permanent first molar. So the occlusal aspect of the permanent first maxillary molar, as you can see, we can see all the four cusps out here, and we can see a lot of grooves as well. So we'll be discussing with each of these about each of these aspects. So by and large, to start with, we can see that there's a mesial outline of the occlusal aspect, there's a distal outline of the occlusal aspect, there's a lingual outline, and there's the buccal outline. So this lingual outline, how can you identify the lingual outline? We have to see or check out the mesiolingual cusp. So the mesiolingual cusp has got this cusp of Caraballi, and you can see the small groove which separates the cusp of Caraballi out here. So the subtle groove. So this is the cusp of Caraballi, and the largest cusp will always be the mesiolingual cusp. So just looking at the size itself, you know that this is the mesiolingual cusp. So if this is the mesiolingual cusp, this has to be the mesiobuccal cusp. If this is the mesiobuccal cusp and that's the buccal aspect, this has to be the distobuccal cusp. And if that is a distobuccal and this is the distal aspect, this has to be the distolingual cusp. So we have a mesiolingual cusp, a distolingual cusp, a distobuccal cusp, and a mesiobuccal cusp. So coming on to how a natural tooth would look like. This is a tooth, this is not a natural tooth, but this is a made up tooth by composite built up walls. So I just put up this picture just to show you why it is important to know about the morphology of teeth. Because every time you see this morphology, to study the morphology of tooth, always understand that even though this is the basic topic, this can be applied into your clinical dentistry in every branch, especially in prosthetics and endodontics, your conservative. So coming on to the occlusal aspect. Now, as I've already explained, the size of the cusp is very important. The largest cusp is your mesiopalatal or your mesiolingual cusp. So the largest is the mesiopalatal cusp. So with that, you can also remember that the mesiopalatal cusp contains or carries the smaller cusp of Caraballi on top of it. So the next is the mesiobuccal cusp, because the mesial aspect is larger than the distal aspect. Then next is the distobuccal cusp, and the smallest would be the distopalatal cusp. Now there are a lot of ridges. Now if I look at this picture, I can very clearly explain the cusps. So the largest cusp is this one, that is your mesiopalatal, and then you have the mesiobuccal, and this is the distolingual and the distopalatal. So now coming on to your ridges, you have mesial and distal marginal ridges and the oblique ridge. Now how will you understand what's the oblique ridge? Oblique ridge is seen on the occlusal aspect, and it very clearly states that it runs obliquely on the occlusal aspect. So you can see it out here where I'm moving the cursor, that I'm making a line which is oblique on the surface of the occlusal aspect of the tooth. So it runs, you just understand that the oblique ridge of on the occlusal aspect of the maxillary permanent first molar is a very crucial is a very crucial ridge, and it runs from the mesiopalatal cusp, that is your largest cusp with an obtuse angle, that is your mesiopalatal cusp. So we can remember mesiopalatal cusp for 2-3 reasons. One, it is the largest cusp. Two, it has a occlusal obtuse angle on the occlusal aspect. And three, it also houses the cusp of Carabelli. So the three reasons why you will remember the mesiopalatal cusp. So your oblique ridge will run from the mesiopalatal cusp to, because it is oblique, it will just go to the opposite side, diagonally opposite side of the mesiopalatal cusp. So what is diagonally opposite to the mesiopalatal? Mesial, the opposite side of mesial is distal, and the opposite side of palatal is buccal. So obviously mesiopalatal, the diagonally opposite side would be distobuccal. So you have the ridge which is running from the mesiopalatal obliquely towards the distobuccal side. So I very clearly said that the ridge runs oblique, in an oblique direction from the mesiobuccal to the mesiopalatal to the distobuccal. So which means that oblique ridge is not the only ridge which starts from the mesiopalatal cusp. So from the mesiopalatal cusp, there's another straight ridge which runs transversely to the opposite side. So this is the transversely running ridge. Again, the cusp is the same. That is your mesiopalatal cusp. So the ridge which runs from the mesiopalatal cusp to the mesiobuccal cusp, that is transversely on the occlusal aspect. This is diagonally or obliquely, and this is transversely. So this is called as a transverse ridge. So in a nutshell, I can say that there are two ridges which basically originate from the mesiopalatal cusp, which means the largest cusp of the permanent maxillary first molar has got two major ridges which originate from its occlusal aspect. So the first ridge that originates runs in a diagonal direction or an oblique direction to the distobuccal cusp. That is called as the oblique ridge, and the other ridge runs in a transverse direction, and that is called as the transverse ridge, that runs towards the mesiobuccal cusp. So one runs towards the distobuccal and the other one runs towards the mesiobuccal. So that is the transverse ridge. So we can see that there's an oblique ridge which runs from the mesiopalatal to the distobuccal, and then there's a transverse ridge which runs from the mesiopalatal to the mesiobuccal. So, so having said that, if I combine it, I have two ridges which run from the mesiopalatal. So then you have two grooves. Now, sulci and depressions are the linear depressions which you find on the occlusal aspect of the tooth. So before going into those grooves, I would rather explain the major and minor foci. So foci is again a depression, but they're not linear depression, they are areas of depression. So you have two major foci, that is called as the central fossa and the distal fossa, and you have two minor foci, that is the mesial triangular fossa and the distal triangular fossa. So let me first explain what is the mesial and distal triangular fossa. Now we all know that this is the mesiopalatal cusp. So if this is the mesiopalatal cusp, this has to be the mesial marginal ridge. So this is the mesial marginal ridge. So this fossa, which is adjacent to the mesial marginal ridge, is called as a mesial triangular fossa. And just on the opposite side, we have the distal marginal ridge. So the fossa which is just adjacent to the distal marginal ridge is called as the distal triangular fossa. So we have two minor fossae, which is the mesial triangular fossa and the distal triangular fossa. Or if you look at this natural tooth, this again is very easy to understand. This is your oblique ridge, and this will be your transverse ridge in this direction. And the fossa here will be your mesial fossa, mesial triangular fossa, and the fossa here will be your distal triangular fossa. So central pit will be the center of the central fossa, and then there'll be a lot of these smaller grooves, central, buccal, and palatal developmental grooves. Now the central groove will be this groove, which is the central groove. Now the buccal and palatal developmental groove, I've already explained on the buccal aspect and the lingual aspect. That is, the buccal developmental groove will separate both the buccal cusps, and it is seen on the buccal aspect, and it will go towards the buccal aspect. And the palatal developmental groove will separate the two lingual cusps, and it will go towards the palatal aspect. So the transverse groove is basically the groove which traverses the oblique ridge. That is, if this is the oblique ridge, if this is the oblique, this is the oblique ridge, and you can see a groove which is traversing the oblique ridge. So this is the oblique ridge, and the groove which basically cuts the oblique ridge is called as the transverse groove. So this is ideally called as a transverse groove of the oblique ridge. So then you have a fifth cusp groove, that is this groove. This is your fifth cusp, that is your cusp of Caravelli. And how will you understand that's the cusp of Caravelli? Because of the subtle groove which is there. So this groove is called as the groove of the fifth cusp. And then there are many small supplemental grooves which are negligent on the surface. So that's in a nutshell about the occlusion surface. So this is again another picture which makes it more easier to understand what all are the different aspects of the occlusal aspect. Now, this is your oblique ridge. Oblique ridge is the most important part of occlusal aspect of the maxillary first molar. So you can see that this ridge starts from the mesiopalatal cusp. Now the mesiopalatal cusp also has got two cuspal ridges, the cuspal slopes. One is the mesial slope and the distal slope. So if I can make it more clearer, the mesiopalatal cusp has got two cuspal slopes. So the oblique ridge originates from the distal slope of the mesiopalatal cusp, and it obliquely runs to the distobuccal cusp. So the distobuccal cusp has got only one ridge originating from it, and that is the oblique ridge. But in case of a mesiopalatal cusp, since it's the biggest one, it has got two slopes, the distal slope and the mesial slope. So from the distal slope of the mesiopalatal, you have the oblique ridge running obliquely, and from the mesial slope of the mesiopalatal cusp, you have the transverse ridge running transversely towards the mesiobuccal cusp. So in the previous picture, as we saw one line out here, that is your oblique ridge, and the other one will be in this direction, that is your transverse ridge. So your mesiopalatal cusp has got two major ridges, and this is your mesial marginal ridge, and this area, this colored area is your mesial triangular fossa. Similarly, just on the opposite side, you have your distal marginal ridge, and this area is your distal triangular fossa. And you have a mesiobuccal cusp ridge out here, a distobuccal cusp ridge out here. This is the distolingual cusp ridge, and this is the mesiopalatal cusp ridge. So ridges are nothing but elevations. So and you have a groove out here. So this groove, which starts from the mesial triangular fossa and runs across the transverse ridge and goes towards the buccal side, is the buccal developmental groove. So the buccal, or if I can say, the buccal developmental groove starts from the buccal aspect, and it traverses in between the mesiobuccal and the distobuccal cusps, and then it takes a turn towards the mesial marginal ridge at the mesial triangular fossa. So that is your mesial pit, or you can call it as a mesial pit when you make a cavity in conservative. So in that case, this is the distal pit, that is the groove which starts from the distal triangular fossa or the distal marginal ridge, and it traverses adjacent to the oblique ridge. Please understand, it does not cross the oblique ridge. It just runs adjacent to the oblique ridge, and it moves towards the lingual aspect. So that is the lingual developmental groove. Fine. So this is how it divides the tooth into parts. So when you make mostly when the tooth gets caries, you either get a distal pit or you get a mesial pit. So conservative dentistry is called so because they teach us to conserve the tooth structure. So when you basically conserve the tooth structure, if the oblique ridge does not have any carious activity out there, you just conserve it. You do not disturb it at all. Instead, you would rather only remove the caries in the mesial pit and in the distal pit, and then fill it up with restorative materials. So this is again just a picture to show you the oblique ridge. I guess this is more clearer. The oblique ridge which runs from the largest cusp, that's your mesiopalatal cusp, towards the outer part, towards the diagonally opposite part, that is your distobuccal cusp. And there will be another line which runs in this direction, that will be your transverse ridge that runs from the mesiopalatal to the mesiobuccal. And this is the mesial triangular fossa. From there, the groove will run, cross the transverse ridge, and go towards the buccal side to become the buccal developmental groove. And from the distal triangular fossa, the groove will run. It will run adjacent to the oblique ridge, and it will come to divide the in between the two lingual cusps and become the lingual developmental groove. And there's a small groove which basically crosses the oblique ridge. That's called as a transverse groove of the oblique ridge. And here you can see the fifth cusp groove. That this is the fifth cusp. That is your cusp of Carabelli. And you can see a small groove which basically divides the cusp of Carabelli separates the cusp of Carabelli from the mesiopalatal cusp. So I've already told you these points, that mesiopalatal is the largest cusp, and there are two major fossae, that is the central fossa, mesial to the oblique ridge. So this is the oblique ridge, and this is the aspect which is mesial to the oblique ridge. So what is the fossa? This is the central fossa. So central fossa is the fossa which is seen mesial to the oblique ridge. This is the oblique ridge. This is the fossa which is mesial to the oblique ridge. And you have a distal fossa which is distal to the oblique ridge. So basic point of reference in a maxillary permanent first molar will be your oblique ridge. And I've already explained about the two triangular fossa, the mesial triangular fossa and the distal triangular fossa. So oblique ridge also I've already told you. So that's these are the root canals. So root canals are basically the radicular pulpal chambers which you find inside the roots. So you can see that the mesiobuccal root has got two root canals. You might see divergent multiple root canals in your mesiobuccal root. So you have mesiobuccal 1, MB1 and MB2 canals. So that's how the root canals will traverse. This is important for you to know when you do your root canal treatments. So that's a chronology of development. We all know that the first evidence of calcification of a first permanent molar will be at birth. So which is why whenever there is any problems during birth or the metabolism arrest during birth, there are more chances that you can see a ring of accentuated enamel neonatal line around the maxillary permanent first molar. And eruption is at 6 years. We all know that it's called, the first molars are called, both maxillary and mandibular are called as 6-year molar, because that's the first permanent tooth which erupt into the oral cavity. So for any root completion, once after the eruption is completed, 2.5 to 3 years of time would be taken by the tooth to complete its root. So if it erupts in 6 years, the root completion will be over by 9 years. If it erupts by 7 years, so the root completion will be over by 10 years of age. So this is just to compare your maxillary teeth from the mandibular tooth. This is the maxillary first molar and this is the mandibular first molar. This is also to show you that whenever you get a tooth, you have to hold it in the anatomical position. So if you get an upper tooth with three roots, you know that it's a maxillary tooth. So you have to hold it with the crown down and the roots up, because that is how anatomically it is present inside your oral cavity. Whereas if you get a mandibular tooth with 2 roots, they'll have the distal root and a mesial root. You have to hold the crown up and the roots down. So basically that is the difference, major difference between maxillary and the mandibular first molars. So the maxillary first molar has got 3 roots and mandibular first molar has got 2 roots. For that matter, every maxillary molar has got 3 roots and every mandibular molars have got 2 roots, except for the third molars, where because for want of space, most of the roots will be always seen fused. So that's about the topic for today. Thank you so much for the patient listening.